When Polish divers finally reached the bottom of the Baltic Sea in the 1970s, they thought they were just exploring another forgotten shipwreck. What they found instead was a time capsule containing the personal belongings of over 10,000 people who died in one night. But as they started bringing artifacts to the surface, they realized this wasn't just any wreck. This was the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, and what lay inside would haunt these divers for the rest of their lives. When Polish divers finally located this forgotten wreck in the 1970s, they weren't prepared for what they'd find inside. You have to understand, this wasn't some planned archaeological expedition. These were sport divers looking for adventure in the Baltic Sea, when they stumbled across something massive lying 150 feet below the surface. The wreck was huge, over 600 feet long, but it was split completely in half. The bow section pointed in one direction, the stern in another, and between them was this massive field of twisted metal and debris. Jerzy Janczukowicz was one of the first divers to really explore the wreck systematically. This guy holds the record for the most dives on the Gustloff. We're talking hundreds of trips down to this underwater graveyard. When he first descended into the wreck in 1973, he wasn't expecting to find anything intact. Most shipwrecks from World War II had been picked clean by scavengers or destroyed by time. But this wreck was different. As Janczukowicz swam through the twisted corridors, his flashlight beam started picking up objects that shouldn't have been there. Personal items, everyday objects. Things that looked like they'd been placed there yesterday, not sitting underwater for nearly 30 years. What made it even more mysterious was the condition of the wreck itself. This wasn't damage from torpedo strikes or natural deterioration. Someone had been here before, someone with explosives. The metal showed clear signs of cutting charges, massive holes blown through the hull that had nothing to do with the original sinking. The midsection had been completely collapsed by what could only be described as systematic demolition. But the artifacts they pulled up told a story nobody expected. The first clue that something extraordinary was happening came when divers started finding objects that defied every expectation about underwater preservation. In the 1980s, Polish divers brought up a collection of medicine bottles from what used to be the ship's pharmacy. These weren't just any bottles. They were glass containers marked with the numbers 200 and R, still containing sediment from whatever medications had been stored inside. After nearly 4 decades underwater in salt water, these bottles should have been corroded beyond recognition. Instead, they looked like they'd just been pulled from a medicine cabinet. The discovery that really got everyone's attention was a silver fork. Not just any fork. This was a small dessert fork with a plain design, the kind you'd use in a formal dining room. When divers cleaned off the tarnish, it shone like new. Think about that for a second. This fork had been sitting at the bottom of the Baltic Sea since 1945, and it emerged looking almost pristine. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was what divers found in the ship's swimming pool area. Using lifting balloons, Belgian and German dive teams in the early 2000s managed to raise a massive mosaic tile weighing 35 pounds. This tile was part of a Neptune-themed decoration that had adorned the pool where hundreds of people died when the first torpedo struck. When they brought it to the surface and rinsed off the marine growth, the colors were still vibrant, the craftsmanship still evident. The artifacts kept coming. Ship's keys with looped steel handles, their metal marked by salt water but still functional. A bronze chandelier from the smoking lounge that divers initially mistook for a safe, causing a media sensation when they realized what they'd actually found. An optical viewfinder from the ship's bridge, the same instrument that would have been used by officers on the night the ship went down. Yet, what they brought to the surface was just the beginning. What made these discoveries so significant wasn't just their preservation. It was what they revealed about the final moments aboard the Gustloff. See, when a ship sinks in combat, you expect chaos. personal belongings scattered, valuable items looted, evidence of panic and desperation. But the artifacts from the Gustloff told a different story. These items were found in their proper locations: the medicine bottles in the pharmacy, the silver fork in the dining area, the chandelier still hanging in what remained of the smoking lounge. This suggested that the sinking happened so quickly that people didn't have time to grab their belongings. Families fleeing the advancing Soviet army had packed their most precious possessions, only to have them become underwater museum pieces in a matter of hours. A small porcelain pot with faded painted scenes, likely carried by a refugee family, showed the human side of this disaster. The chip and crack in its surface told the story of that final night better than any history book. But there was something else troubling about these discoveries. The systematic cutting and demolition of the wreck meant that someone had been here before the sport divers. Someone with resources, equipment, and a very specific agenda. The holes blown in the hull weren't random. They were precise, purposeful, almost surgical in their placement. Because what came up next would haunt these divers for decades. What the divers didn't know was that some of the most disturbing discoveries were still waiting in the deeper sections of the wreck. Objects that suggested the final moments were even more horrific than anyone had imagined. Every item these divers pulled from the wreck told the story of 10,000 people's final moments. When you're diving a wreck like the Gustloff, you start to develop an almost supernatural connection to the people who died there. It's not just about the big discoveries, it's about the small, personal items that make you realize these weren't just statistics. These were real people, with real lives, carrying real memories. Yontukovich described finding a wooden deck plank that had actually washed ashore back in 1945, mixed in with bodies and debris along the German coast. Someone had carved this plank into a Madonna figure and gifted it to a survivor. Imagine that, taking a piece of wood from the ship that killed thousands of people and turning it into a symbol of hope and faith. The emotional weight of something like that hits you right in the gut. The divers also recovered what appeared to be personal luggage items, small suitcase fragments, pieces of clothing that had somehow survived the decades underwater. These weren't valuable artifacts in any monetary sense, but they represented something far more precious, the last remaining evidence of families who thought they were escaping to safety. One of the most haunting discoveries was a collection of children's items. Toy fragments, small shoes, pieces of what might have been dolls or games. Remember, this ship was packed with families. Mothers and fathers who had grabbed their children and whatever belongings they could carry, believing they were headed toward freedom. Instead, they became part of the largest maritime disaster in human history. But some of these objects defied explanation. The condition of these personal artifacts raised questions that nobody could answer satisfactorily. Take the wooden deck plank Madonna figure. How does wood survive underwater for decades and then emerge in carving condition? The preservation shouldn't have been possible, yet there it was. Or consider the silver items that kept appearing. Not just the dessert fork, but other pieces of silverware, serving utensils, decorative items. Silver tarnishes, yes, but it doesn't disappear. These items emerge from the wreck looking like they could be polished and used today. The medicine bottles presented another mystery. Glass breaks easily, especially old glass subjected to underwater pressure and salt corrosion. Yet these bottles not only survived intact, they still contained remnants of their original contents. The sediment inside the 200 and R marked bottles suggested they might have held pills or powder medications. After 4 decades underwater, this sediment had turned into a kind of archaeological evidence of the ship's medical facilities. But the discovery that really challenged everyone's understanding was the 35-pound mosaic tile from the Neptune swimming pool. This wasn't just a decorative element. This was a piece of art that had adorned one of the ship's most luxurious areas. The fact that it could be lifted intact using balloons, and that its colors remained vibrant after underwater storage, suggested conditions inside the wreck that nobody fully understood. Museum records show that Polish divers in the 1980s were finding artifacts in remarkably good condition throughout the ship, not just in protected areas, but in sections that should have been completely exposed to the elements. This preservation wasn't random. It seemed to follow patterns that suggested specific areas of the ship had been sealed or protected in ways that shouldn't have been possible. What made these discoveries even more chilling was their condition. The pristine state of these artifacts suggested something about the wreck that made experienced divers deeply uncomfortable. Professional maritime archaeologists will tell you that shipwrecks are supposed to deteriorate in predictable ways. Metal corrodes, wood rots, fabric dissolves, glass breaks. The rate of deterioration depends on water temperature, salinity, current, and depth, but it's always consistent within those parameters. The Baltic Sea has specific characteristics that should have affected everything inside the Gustloff wreck in similar ways. But that's not what divers found. Some sections of the ship contained artifacts in museum-quality condition, while other areas showed the expected deterioration. This inconsistency suggested that parts of the ship had been sealed off from the surrounding water, creating microenvironments where normal decay processes couldn't occur. The implications were disturbing. If sections of the ship had remained sealed since 1945, what else might be preserved inside? Were there areas that divers hadn't yet accessed, containing artifacts, or worse, in even better condition? The thought that personal belongings, documentation, or other evidence might be sitting in underwater time capsules was both exciting and terrifying. Consider the emotional impact on the divers themselves. Jan Sukovich spent decades exploring this wreck, bringing up artifact after artifact that connected him directly to the people who died there. Each discovery was like opening a personal letter from someone who had been dead for 40 years. The psychological toll of that experience affected every diver who spent significant time exploring the Gustloff. Yet divers knew something far more valuable might still be down there. Because while the personal artifacts were haunting, rumors were circulating about discoveries that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Treasures that powerful people had died trying to protect. The Soviets didn't just find this wreck first. They blasted it apart, searching for something worth more than gold. Here's where the story gets really weird. Those precise demolition cuts that Polish divers found in the 1970s? They weren't made by Polish divers. By the time sport divers reached the wreck, someone had already been there with industrial cutting equipment and explosives. Someone with the resources and motivation to conduct a massive underwater operation in secret. Soviet naval records, which only became available decades later, revealed that diving operations on the Gustloff had begun as early as 1948. We're talking about systematic, military-grade salvage operations, conducted just 3 years after the war ended. This wasn't archaeological curiosity, this was a treasure hunt conducted by one of the world's most powerful military forces. The evidence was all over the wreck, massive holes blown through multiple decks, creating access routes that bypassed the ship's original structure. Whole sections that had been cut away with precision that suggested underwater cutting torches operated by professionals. The bow and stern had been completely separated, not by torpedo damage, but by controlled demolition designed to provide maximum access to the ship's interior. Polish diving teams in 1955 documented what they called unusual cutting techniques throughout the wreck. Some of these cuts were attributed to unknown parties, possibly NATO forces, possibly other Soviet operations that weren't officially acknowledged. The absence of expected human remains relative to the known death toll suggested what investigators euphemistically called cleansing operations, systematic removal of bodies and personal belongings. But Here's what makes this really mysterious. Despite all this massive effort, despite years of secret operations involving military divers and demolition experts, nobody has ever publicly admitted to finding anything of significant value. Either the Soviets found what they were looking for and never revealed it, or they spent enormous resources searching for something that was never actually there. What they were hunting for would explain everything. The scale of the treasure rumors surrounding the Gustloff was staggering, involving some of the most valuable lost artifacts in human history. The primary target was the Amber Room, 6 tons of amber panels, backed with gold leaf and precious stones, originally installed in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. When Nazi forces looted this priceless chamber, valued today at over $250 million, it disappeared completely. Intelligence reports suggested it had been shipped to Königsberg for safekeeping, and multiple sources claimed it was loaded aboard the Gustloff during the evacuation. Think about what 6 tons of amber panels would mean to a salvage operation. This wasn't just valuable artwork. This was irreplaceable cultural heritage that could never be legally sold, but could be used as leverage in international negotiations. The Soviets would have considered recovering the Amber Room a matter of national pride, justifying any resources necessary to retrieve it. But the Amber Room wasn't the only treasure allegedly aboard the Gustloff. A 1988 expedition specifically targeted what they believed was Hitler's reserve suite, searching for $100 million in gold bullion that intelligence reports suggested had been smuggled aboard. This wasn't random speculation. This was organized treasure hunting based on specific intelligence about wartime asset movement. The expedition recovered portholes and other ship fixtures, but found no gold. However, the fact that they were conducting targeted searches based on wartime intelligence suggests that someone, somewhere, had credible information about valuable cargo aboard the Gustloff. Whether that information was accurate is another question entirely. Survivor accounts added fuel to these rumors. Some refugees claimed to have seen SS officers loading heavy crates into secured areas of the ship just before departure. Others described unusual activity around the ship's cargo holds, with areas that were normally accessible to passengers being cordoned off by armed guards. But decades of searching revealed a disturbing truth. The treasure hunting operations revealed something far more significant than missing gold or amber panels. They revealed the lengths to which powerful organizations would go to recover lost assets. Consider the resources involved in the Soviet operations. Military divers, underwater cutting equipment, demolition charges, specialized salvage vessels, all deployed in secret operations that continued for years. This wasn't a casual search. This was a systematic attempt to recover specific items that intelligence services believed were aboard the ship. The precision of the demolition work suggests that the Soviets had detailed plans of the ship's structure. They knew exactly where to cut to access cargo holds, passenger areas, and secured compartments. This level of preparation indicates advanced intelligence about what was aboard and where it was stored. But here's what's really disturbing. After all this effort, after years of secret operations and massive resource investment, nothing of significant value has ever been publicly recovered from the Gustloff. Either the treasures were never there to begin with, or they were recovered and hidden so successfully that no trace has ever emerged. The systematic cleansing of bodies and belongings suggests another motive entirely. Maybe the Soviets weren't just looking for treasure. Maybe they were looking for evidence, documents, communications, intelligence materials that could be used for propaganda or prosecution purposes. The thorough removal of personal belongings could have been designed to eliminate evidence of war crimes or to prevent the wreck from becoming a memorial site. The ongoing secrecy around these operations, even decades after the Cold War ended, suggests that whatever the Soviets found, or didn't find, remains sensitive information. The fact that modern expeditions continue to find no evidence of the rumored treasures doesn't prove they were never there. It only proves that if they existed, they've been very effectively hidden, because what divers found instead was far more unsettling. While treasure hunters were blasting holes in the ship looking for gold and amber, they were inadvertently uncovering evidence of something much more horrific, proof that some passengers might have survived the initial sinking only to face something worse. In 2019, French soldiers made an illegal dive that uncovered something that had been missing for 7 years. Picture this: French military divers conducting training exercises in the Baltic Sea decide to make an unauthorized dive on the Gustloff wreck. They're not supposed to be there. The site has been a protected war grave since 1994, with diving restricted within 500 meters. But they go down anyway, probably thinking they're just taking a quick look at a historical site. Instead, they find a body. Not skeletal remains from 1945, not artifacts or debris, but a recent body trapped inside the wreck. The French soldiers immediately surface and alert Polish authorities, who coordinate with professional dive teams to recover what turns out to be Robert Schlecht, a Polish diver who had been missing for 7 years. Schlecht had disappeared in 2012 during what his partners claimed was a routine dive on the wreck. His body was found in the interior of the ship, in a location that suggested he had become trapped or disoriented while exploring the wreck's labyrinthine interior. The discovery led to criminal charges against his diving partners, who were accused of failing to provide adequate safety measures or proper reporting of his disappearance. But here's what makes this discovery particularly disturbing. Schlecht's body was found in an area of the wreck that should have been thoroughly explored decades earlier. How does a modern diver become trapped in a section of ship that has been visited by hundreds of other divers over the past 40 years? What was he doing in that particular area, and why didn't his partners report him missing immediately? The incident highlighted the ongoing risks associated with diving the Gustloff. But it also raised questions about how much of the wreck remains unexplored. How many hidden chambers and sealed compartments might still contain surprises. But this wasn't the first time human remains surfaced from this wreck. The discovery of human remains in and around the Gustloff wreck has been a recurring theme since the 1970s. Each incident revealing new mysteries about what happened during the sinking. In 1973, Jerzy Janczukowicz spotted a soldier's skeleton, still wearing boots, preserved in one of the ship's corridors. The condition of the remains suggested they had been protected from marine life and normal decomposition processes, possibly by being trapped in an air pocket or sealed compartment. This discovery was significant because it provided physical evidence that some victims had survived long enough after the torpedo strikes to reach interior areas of the ship. The 1945 recovery operations along the German and Polish coasts had documented 347 bodies washing ashore, but that number represented only a tiny fraction of the estimated 9,000 A+ fatalities. Most bodies were never recovered, leading to assumptions that they had been lost at sea or buried by shifting sediments. The discovery of remains inside the wreck suggested that many victims might have been trapped inside the ship as it sank. Survivor accounts from 1945 provided disturbing details about what happened to people who didn't make it off the ship. Stories of frozen child corpses, of an officer's tragic final act, of families trapped together in areas where they thought they would be safe. These accounts painted a picture of chaos and terror that was difficult to reconcile with the orderly artifacts that divers were finding decades later. But the most haunting evidence came from survivor testimonies, describing lights flickering inside sections of the ship that were already underwater. People reported seeing figures moving behind portholes, hearing sounds of people pounding on windows from inside submerged compartments. These accounts suggested that some passengers had survived the initial torpedo strikes and flooding, only to become trapped in air pockets as the ship continued to sink. Physical evidence supporting these accounts included structural damage that suggested internal explosions or attempts to break through bulkheads from inside. Dented metal surfaces showing impact patterns consistent with desperate attempts to escape. Door frames twisted in ways that suggested people had tried to force their way through as water levels rose. What these findings revealed changed everything we thought we knew. The discovery of human remains, both historical and recent, fundamentally altered the understanding of what happened aboard the Gustloff and what continues to happen to people who explore the wreck. The scarcity of remains relative to the known death toll initially supported theories about Soviet cleansing operations. If military divers had systematically removed bodies and personal belongings, it would explain why the wreck seemed so empty compared to the scale of the disaster. But the discovery of preserved remains in protected areas suggested a more complex story. Some victims had clearly survived long enough to reach areas of the ship that provided temporary protection from the flooding. The soldier found in 1973, still in full uniform and boots, had obviously not died immediately when the torpedoes struck. He had made it to an interior area, possibly thinking he was moving toward safety, only to become trapped as the ship settled on the bottom. The condition of these remains also provided clues about the internal environment of the wreck. Preservation that good suggested areas with limited water circulation, possibly sealed compartments where normal decomposition processes couldn't occur. This raised disturbing questions about whether other sealed areas might contain additional remains, and whether some passengers had survived for extended periods in air pockets before eventually succumbing. Robert Schlecht's death in 2012 demonstrated that the wreck continues to pose risks to modern divers. The complex internal structure, multiple levels, twisted corridors, and collapsed sections create a maze that can trap even experienced divers. The fact that his partners were charged with criminal negligence suggests that his death might have been preventable, raising questions about other diving incidents that might not have been properly reported. The ongoing discovery of human remains, separated by nearly 40 years, suggests that the Gustloff continues to reveal its secrets gradually. Each incident provides new information about the disaster and its aftermath, but also raises new questions about what else might be waiting inside the wreck. Because the most chilling discovery suggests some victims may have survived the initial sinking. Survivor accounts describe something that still gives divers nightmares. Lights flickering inside the wreck, revealing trapped souls. Imagine being a survivor floating in a lifeboat in the middle of the Baltic Sea, watching the Gustloff disappear beneath the waves. You're dealing with your own trauma, your own survival, the loss of family and friends. But then you see something that doesn't make sense. Lights flickering inside sections of the ship that are already underwater. Multiple survivors reported this phenomenon. Not just one or two people who might have been hallucinating from shock or hypothermia, but multiple independent witnesses describing the same thing. Electrical systems still functioning in submerged parts of the ship, and shadows moving behind portholes in areas that should have been completely flooded. The most disturbing accounts described sounds: metallic pounding, rhythmic banging that seemed to come from inside the wreck. Survivors interpreted this as people trapped inside sealed compartments, trying to signal for help or attempting to break through barriers to reach air pockets. The pounding continued for hours after the ship disappeared, gradually growing weaker until it finally stopped. Some survivors reported seeing faces at portholes in underwater sections, people pressing against the glass as if trying to communicate with those outside. Whether these were real sightings or trauma-induced hallucinations is impossible to verify, but the consistency of the reports suggests that something was happening inside the submerged wreck that defied normal expectations about drowning victims. The psychological impact on survivors who witnessed these phenomena was devastating. They spent the rest of their lives wondering whether they could have done something to help the trapped passengers, whether rescue operations might have been possible if the lights and sounds had been taken seriously by rescue vessels. The evidence suggests the unthinkable. Physical evidence discovered inside the wreck decades later provided support for the survivor accounts of prolonged survival in air pockets. Structural engineers who examined the wreck in the 1990s and 2000s identified multiple compartments that could have contained air pockets during the sinking. The ship's design included watertight compartments that were intended to prevent flooding from spreading throughout the vessel. While these compartments failed to save the ship, they might have created temporary refuge areas for passengers who were unable to reach the deck. The discovery of human remains in interior areas of the ship provided direct evidence that some victims had survived long enough to reach these compartments. The positioning of the remains suggested they had been seeking higher ground within the ship, moving away from flooded areas toward what they believed would be safety. The preservation of clothing and personal effects indicated that these areas had indeed remained sealed from direct water exposure. Divers exploring the wreck found evidence of desperate attempts to escape from sealed areas. Metal surfaces showed impact damage, consistent with people using tools or heavy objects to try to break through bulkheads or portholes. Door frames were bent and twisted in ways that suggested sustained efforts to force passage between compartments. The electrical systems of the Gustloff were designed with multiple backup circuits and emergency lighting systems. Evidence suggests that some of these systems continued to function even after the ship was underwater, powered by battery backups that could have operated for several hours. This would explain the flickering lights that survivors reported seeing in submerged sections of the ship. Air pocket analysis conducted by maritime engineers confirmed that the ship's structure could have supported temporary air pockets in several areas. The rate of flooding, the ship's orientation as it sank, and the design of interior compartments all contributed to conditions where air could have been trapped temporarily, providing breathable atmosphere for people who had reached these areas. Temperature analysis of the Baltic Sea in January 1945 revealed that hypothermia would have been a more immediate threat than drowning for people trapped in air pockets. Water temperatures near freezing would have meant that even people with access to air would have had limited survival time, unless they could stay dry and warm. What this means about the final hours is almost too horrible to comprehend. The evidence of air pocket survival fundamentally changes our understanding of the Gustloff disaster, from a quick drowning tragedy to a prolonged nightmare of trapped passengers slowly dying in sealed compartments. Consider the psychological horror of being trapped in an air pocket inside a sinking ship. You've survived the initial torpedo strikes, you've made it to what seems like a safe area. You have air to breathe and space to move around. But you're trapped 150 feet underwater, with no way to signal for help and no possibility of rescue. You can hear the ship settling around you. Feel the temperature dropping. Know that your air supply is limited. The survivor accounts of lights and sounds take on a much more horrific meaning in this context. Those weren't hallucinations or electrical malfunctions. Those were real people, trapped in sealed compartments, using whatever power and resources they had to try to signal for help. The rhythmic pounding wasn't random noise. It was deliberate communication attempts by people who remained conscious and alert for hours after the ship sank. The positioning of human remains found inside the wreck tells the story of these final hours. Bodies found in upper areas of compartments, positioned as if they had been trying to stay above rising water levels. Personal belongings arranged in ways that suggested people had time to organize their possessions while waiting for rescue that never came. Evidence of families who had stayed together, parents who had tried to protect children even in these impossible circumstances. The physical evidence of escape attempts reveals the desperation of these trapped passengers. People using whatever tools they could find to try to break through steel bulkheads. Families working together to try to force open doors or portholes. Groups of passengers combining their efforts in coordinated attempts to reach other parts of the ship. The timeline suggested by this evidence is almost unbearable to contemplate. While rescue ships were picking up survivors from the water, there were still people alive inside the submerged wreck, breathing trapped air and hoping for rescue. Some of these people might have survived for 6, 8, even 12 hours after the ship sank, gradually running out of air or succumbing to hypothermia in their underwater prison. The discovery of these conditions affected every subsequent exploration of the wreck. Divers reported an almost supernatural sense of presence inside certain compartments, an emotional weight that made even experienced professionals uncomfortable. Knowing that they were swimming through areas where people had spent their final hours in terror and desperation created a psychological burden that many divers found difficult to handle. Modern diving operations on the Gustloff are conducted with this knowledge in mind. The wreck isn't just a historical site or an archaeological curiosity. It's a mass grave where thousands of people died in conditions that challenge our understanding of maritime disasters. The respect accorded to the site reflects not just the scale of the tragedy, but the prolonged suffering of victims who survived the initial sinking, only to face an even worse fate. What other WWII wrecks hide similar secrets? Subscribe for more forgotten tragedies that changed history.